I came over in the morning to pick Martin up, to drive him to the airport to go to Memphis. The children saw him going to the airport all the time. But this day, the boys blocked the door and said, "Daddy, don't leave." And he said, "Oh, I'll be right back. I'm just going down to Memphis. I'll be back." Then they ran ahead of him and blocked the stairs and said, "Daddy, don't leave us." And he said, "Listen, I'm coming right back. I'm just going to go down there for a march. You know, I explained why I'm going. These people have been mistreated in Memphis, and I'm going to do something about it. That's my work, and you know that." They ran over to my car, and then they jumped on the hood of the car, pleading again through the window, "Daddy, please don't go. Daddy, please don't leave us. Daddy, please." Such pleading. We backed out of the driveway and got on the way. And he said, "What in the world happened to these kids? They must be trying to tell me that they're missing me more. And when I come back, I've got to change my habits. I can't go through this."
I watched the transformation take place from the man that I met in the first instance to the man he became in the end. With all of his experience, he really was not quite ready for the human heart to reveal as much villainy. What he saw was more hate than he saw resolve.
We were trying to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. And Martin had become far more exposed to enemies by taking on both civil rights and the war issue.
I couldn't imagine the pressure that was on him. Nobody could. None of us could imagine that. It was just too overwhelming.
The most difficult time of his life was the 18 months before his assassination. Very difficult time.
The Moses of 1968, Martin Luther King.
He was disappointed, and he wondered whether or not he could do any more than he'd done.
It had bothered him deeply that the nation had turned against him. And I always tell people he died of a broken heart.
I think he worried about dying before he had accomplished enough. It's as though that he knew that he was not going to be here for the rest of the struggle.
We've got some difficult days ahead.
The movement ceased to be political for him. It was spiritual.
But it really doesn't matter with me now.
He said, "We have wandered in the wilderness of separate but equal, and we're about to move into the promised land of creative integration. And I don't know whether I'll get there, but my people will get to the promised land."
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I'm 86, and you know there's an African proverb that says if surviving lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit.
I tell the story of Martin Luther King as I knew it. I lived it. I value all of what they gave me now that I can remember. I'm not just telling stories. I'm not making a speech. I'm telling you what happened.
Straight, civil rights, King, Van Oker, roll 20, sound 36. Andy.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. And that particular struggle centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. That period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. Because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood that August day in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision a war in Asia and in the ghettos of the North?
No, I didn't envision that then. In 1963, to be in the March on Washington, it meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
We were all caught off guard when we saw the rebellions begin. They started in Harlem and then Philadelphia in 1964, and then Watts in 1965, which was the most massive.
Martin called me early in the morning saying that there's a riot in Watts. We've got to go to Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, my dear friends of Los Angeles and the Watts area of this city. Now, I live approximately 2,500 miles from here. I'm not free there, and our brothers and sisters are not free there. And you are not free in California and in the North. I've said all over America, and I come out to Watts to tell you today, no matter what color you are somebody. And all over the United States of America, the Negro must join hands, and we must work.
Dr. King said that the ride became the language of the unheard.
You all know my philosophy. You all know that I believe firmly in nonviolence, or maybe some of you don't quite agree with this.
Nonviolence is more than a tactic. It is one of those immutable principles that you cannot deviate from if you're going to be able to redeem the soul of America.
The issues in Watts and in the North were far more complex than black and white as they had been in the South. He was dealing with racism, but he was dealing with racism that was complicated by unemployment and unprepared migrants moving from the south to the north. And I realized we were in a different movement.
What we saw it as a lot of people who were suffering from the same kind of poverty, the same kind of absence of employment opportunities, and police brutality were in the urban areas, and they responded with whatever weapons they could find.
The president during the riots was just depressed. About a week before, Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act. Tells me this is the most important piece of legislation I'll pass, even more important than the '64 Civil Rights Act. He's virtually carried out of the room on shoulders. And then we start the massive rioting in Watts. So he tells me, call Dr. King.
Hello? Yes, Dr. King.
Yes, well, we're in a difficult situation here.
How do you see it?
Well, I'll tell you, Mr. President, I've talked with people in the Watts area. I'm fearful that if something isn't done to give a new sense of hope to people in that area, that a full-scale race war can be going.
I spent the biggest part of my life for the last 4 years on civil rights bills, but all of it comes to naught if you have a situation like war in the world or a situation in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
All of this was happening about the same time that the war in Vietnam heated up. And the president was in the midst of a very heavy burden, both with war and domestically.
And I want peace as much as you do, and more so, because I'm a fellow that had to wake up this morning with 50 Marines killed. But these folks, they all got the impression, too, that you're against me in Vietnam.
I've said this, Mr. President, and I am concerned about peace.
Dr. King made the decision in '65 that he had to be against the war. We went to meet with Ambassador Goldberg at the United Nations, and Goldberg pretty much agreed with us that the war in Vietnam was not in anybody's interest. But the press said that he had no business having an opinion about foreign affairs. He was a civil rights leader, see? And it hurt him.
He said to me, he said, Vivian, you don't think I know what I'm talking about, do you? But he knew how he felt about the war. Also, I think Martin knew that he had to be a part of the North sooner or later.
One must understand that the civil rights legislation that we have had over the last few years, even the voting rights bill, which came the other day, didn't do too much to improve the lot of the thousands and millions of Negroes in teeming ghettos of the North.
I opposed FCLC moving north because we weren't finished in the South. We needed to continue political education, and we needed to work on building an economic base.
Martin could sit there for an hour, listen to us argue about, no, let's go here, let's go there, let's teach this, let's do whatever. But he would teach a lot by asking questions. There was sudden quiet would come over the room because he wanted to make people think about what they wanted. Martin could be very quiet and have all the power in the room.
Martin had decided that we had to prove that nonviolence was relevant in the North, that we had to find a way to get into these northern cities before the riots occurred. And so we went north to Chicago.
I do not know that everything that Martin said or did, he was quite prepared for. He had felt that in many ways, dealing with the South was a more predictable outcome because in the North, the racial hypocrisy was very subverted. It gave the appearance of being not like the South. The South was the center of all evil, and the North was a place of the higher experience. And Dr. King said, no, that's not the case.
We moved into an apartment on 16th and Hamlin. It was a walk-up apartment with no lights, no heat, and it took quite an adjustment. I never got scared in the South. I knew the dangers. And I was prepared to get killed in the South. But I wasn't ready to, to have a junkie stick a knife in me in the middle of the night, coming into that apartment for maybe $15 or $20 that I had in my pocket.
That first night was a very cold night, and I got really worried that there weren't going to be enough blankets. So we went and got the blankets and went over to see Dr. King in his apartment. And as we were sitting there, the doorbell rang, and there was a young man there. The first thing he said when he came in the door was, "Are you really Martin Luther King?" They had a very lovely conversation, with Dr. King really saying, "We want you to join the movement." And pretty soon later, there was another knock on the door, and there was like a whole train of them going down the stairs. And those young men came back a number of times to see Dr. King.
People in the community, they would just hang around waiting for him to come downstairs, so they could see him. But he would invite them in, sit down and talk to people. They didn't think he was the kind of person they could talk to. Then it made them feel, well, honestly, that they were worthwhile as well.
Martin understood that if you ran with folk, you could organize folk. Remember, we've spent all of our lives being hated in one form or the other. But when we see somebody who really cares for people, period, right? That person is worth knowing.
The first week we moved in, the temperature dropped to about 16 degrees below zero. And people came to us to complain that they had no heat. And to find babies wrapped in newspaper, we had to start firing the furnaces. So we got all the money we could, and we got enough coal to get all of the furnaces to work. We call the movement in Chicago the Movement to End Slums. And it plunged us into several issues. One was the area of poor housing. The other was the area of quality education and also unemployment.
I feel like we know more about our problem than Dr. King because we live here.
What would you suggest that he do, Reverend Mitchell?
I would suggest when they come down to our city, you should get the hell out of here.
So first we ran into stiff black resistance. We'd never met that in Montgomery, Birmingham, or Selma before. That was different.
A lot of the ministers were part of the patronage system. Mayor Daley's patronage system was one where people's jobs were handed out based on the number of votes that they could produce. They called it the Daley machine.
Martin had anxiety because, as he put it, we don't want to flunk. We don't want to fail in our projects.
We met regularly with Mayor Daley, and we disagreed because we were challenging the way Chicago was structured.
I think we're beginning to crystallize some of the problems and understand what we might do to begin to make some changes.
Does it mean demonstrations too, possibly?
Yes, it would mean demonstrations, but I think just when it would mean demonstrations, we wouldn't be able to say.
At the same time, we were still being pulled back to the South, and James Meredith decided to have a march in Mississippi.
When James Meredith, the Negro who desegregated the University of Mississippi, started the march, only 3 friends walked with him.
The surest way to power is through the vote. And it is for this reason that I have decided to use all of my spare time trying to encourage Negroes to register and vote. And that is the purpose of this march today.
Mississippi wanted black folk to leave. They didn't want them to be there to vote. They were trying to starve them out. They were pushing people off the land, wanted them to go north. And the violence continued.
James Meredith's march was a march against fear. We had seen people in Mississippi getting killed for trying to register to vote because they didn't want them to have power. So he was trying to empower African Americans to not be fearful of all the threats.
If I can walk through Mississippi without harm, Meredith told reporters, other Negroes will see that they can too.
At that time, me and Stokely Carmichael were officers of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and someone came along and told us that James Meredith had been shot.
I'm hit in the leg and in the head. Ain't nobody gonna get me in a car. Here it comes right now, Jimmy.
The Meredith March wasn't on anybody's agenda. He didn't consult with anybody. But with the shooting of Meredith, Dr. King and civil rights leaders rallied around that.
This march that we are continuing, started by James Meredith, I am convinced will have as greater impact, or probably a greater impact, than the march from Selma to Montgomery.
The youth and can still be shot down on the highways in Mississippi, peacefully walking. That march needs to be big.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
No more questions.
Martin felt we could not ignore what was happening in Mississippi.
Got the march.
So we had to divide what we were doing in Chicago. And so we had a Mississippi march and a Chicago movement.
From the moment that the civil rights leaders rushed in to continue James Meredith's march, there's been a struggle to see whose philosophy would guide the steps. The philosophical struggle deepened as the march column moved deeper into Mississippi. The voice of Stokely Carmichael, young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, spoke louder and louder. At Greenwood, he sounded the march's new rallying call.
It's time we stand up and take over. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power.
In SNCC, we saw a changing movement tactically. Our focus was on empowering communities,
We don't have to be ashamed of it.
not only politically, but in terms of culture and identity.
What do you want? That's what we gonna get.
What they were basically saying is that black people needed to appreciate black. And it wasn't a color, it was a culture. Now, when I was growing up, to call a person of color black was considered derogatory. Those were fighting words. But there was a term that was used as well during that period, white power.
Stokely Carmichael gets control of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he purges the organization of all white people. He said, you go back and work in your community. We want to have total control. It rippled throughout the movement.
I will never forget Dr. King's face when Black Power first began to emerge. He looked like the most stricken man.
We must never forget, there are some white people in the United States just as determined to see us free as we are to be free ourselves.
We were taught that there were good people and bad people, and we never viewed this as black against white. We're taught that racism was a sickness, and you don't get mad with sick people. They just don't know any better. They've been taught that they are better than you.
What do you mean when you shout black power to these people back here?
I mean that they are oppressed because they are black, And their rallying cry must be black power, so that they can use that to ensure justice for themselves.
Martin's very uncomfortable, but he knows that he has to be there to support the courage of Stokely Carmichael without supporting the message or the form of the message. Dr. King was not opposed to power, but to elevate so-called black power over white power would break that which he was seeking to build, the coalition among white and black people.
I feel that while believing firmly that power is necessary, that it would be difficult for me to use the phrase black power because of the connotative meaning that it has for many people and the feeling that this may represent a desire to rise from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thereby subverting justice. On the other hand,
some of the people on the march were intimidated by the whole effort of black power.
They must ask themselves why they are afraid of the word black and why they're afraid of the phrase black power.
As long as we were talking about nonviolence and all that kind of thing, everybody felt comfortable.
Do you think they're really afraid of it or just feel that it's not a good thing?
Anytime when we talk about black people having power, the assumption is that black people want to be violent against white people.
Mr. Carmichael, are you as committed to the nonviolent approach as Dr. King is?
No, I'm not.
Why aren't you?
Well, I just don't see it as a way of life. I never have. I grew up in the slums of New York, and I learned there that the only way that one survived was to use his fists. I realized
when Stokely became chairman of SNCC, he had a different approach.
And for me, it's always been a tactic and never a way of life.
He believed in self-defense.
Could you comment on that, Dr. King?
The Negro has an opportunity to inject morality in the veins of our civilization, and for this reason, I will continue to preach nonviolence. I will continue to...
Martin was an amazingly tolerant, understanding father figure for all of us. He understood Stokely's frustrations, and he never took it personally. I think Dr. King never forgot that we were all on the same side. He didn't have any enemies.
What I remember was the listening, the patience. He was always there. To say I don't go there, but I want to really understand why you go there. But that was the first real breach in the nonviolence commitment that many of us had grown to accept.
I'm sick and tired of violence. I'm tired of shooting. I'm tired of hate. I'm tired of selfishness. I'm tired of evil. I'm not going to use violence, no matter who says it.
I had not, before meeting Dr. King, ever taken the option of violence off the table. We are a minority living in the belly of the beast. When Dr. King stepped in, he methodically would look at violence and challenge those who would seek the gun as the solution. Because morally, you cannot defeat the enemy by becoming the enemy. But Stokely really believed that in the long run, the gun was going to have to be the answer.
And we begged the president, we begged the federal government. That's all we've been doing.
I accused Stokely of being just an angry, frustrated young man.
It's time we stand up and take over. Every courthouse in Mississippi ought to be burned down tomorrow to get rid of the dirt.
Anger eats away at your own soul, and it hurts you. Everybody has a right to be angry. Everybody has a right to be frustrated. But if you give in to your anger and your frustrations, you know, you're going to lose.
This day, we must commit ourselves to make any sacrifice necessary to change Chicago this day.
That summer of '66 did feel like a very turbulent time.
We must avoid the error of building a distrust with all white people.
There was some question about whether it was appropriate for white people to stay working with the movement. And I remember one of my black friends saying to me, "We need to know we can do this ourselves." And in the middle of all that was the rising of the Vietnam War. Many of the staff who were very strongly opposed to the war were trying to get Dr. King to speak out against it.
Martin was now being pulled back into the war issue by the student left. And so you had almost three things coming together in Chicago, pulling the same leadership in different directions.
This day, we must decide that our votes will determine who will be the mayor of Chicago next year.
Mayor Daley was very upset about what was going on here. And he was in touch with Lyndon Johnson and said, get this Martin Luther King off my back.
How are you, my friend? Oh, good. How are you, Mr. President? What shape have you got King in? Is he about ready to get out?
Well, I don't think so. I think we've gone a long way with a good doctor, Mr. President. He's not your friend. He's against Vietnam. He's a goddamn faker.
Do you think that you got things in pretty good shape in Chicago?
Well, as good as they can be.
The area that the movement insisted on getting into was open housing.
What is the makeup of the community here? What would be the reaction of the community to a Negro family moving in?
Oh, I don't think they'd like it. They're very clannish in a way.
Chicago is probably the most segregated city I know. It's not only segregated black and white, but the Irish, the Italians, the Polish, the Jewish community. Almost everybody lives in its own enclave in Chicago. And so we started marching into those ethnic neighborhoods. And we were challenging Chicago simply by marching.
I moved out of a neighborhood that was colored. Everybody that lives with the colored has to move.
Why?
Because you're not safe walking the streets at night. You cannot leave the house.
Negroes have a right to move in under the Constitution. The only thing is, what kind of a Negro?
Our marches were to the real estate offices because the real estate agents control the movement of people. They're the ones who were managing this discrimination.
Every time Negroes went in, the real estate agent said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything listed. And then we sent some of our fine white staff members into those same real estate offices, and the minute the white persons got in, they opened the book. Oh, yes, well, we have several things. Now, what exactly do you want? Something is going to happen as a result of this, and I'm not losing faith. I still have faith in the future.
Communist! Communist! Move it back! Move it back! Move it back!
I remember marching through Gage Park.